Welcome, everyone, to our newest episode of Limitless EdX. This is Andrea Harris from Lumino Home Learning, and I'm joined by.
Jeanette Easton from Refound Education.
And today we are talking about a subject we are both so passionate about. Today we will be talking about special education and how it is in crisis and what is broken and how we can fix it. We have both been experiencing for over a decade, for sure, you over 2 decades, about special education in the school system and what it looks like and what the issues are. And ironically, we found towards the end of our careers in the school system in Ontario that not a lot had changed. So, Jeanette, do you want to dive into how we can kick this off today?
Absolutely. I feel like it has changed. It has gotten worse,
Yeah.
sadly. Um, it's yeah. So the funding is we are out, like we are behind 4 to 5 years on funding for children with special needs. And it makes me want to yak, quite frankly. It's just so nauseating to see how money is being mismanaged to scale and that these kids are not getting the support they need. And how we treat the most vulnerable within our society, I think, is a reflection of who we all are. And we need to do better. Um,
And just to jump in and clarify too, because as a parent who doesn't have special needs children, can you clarify what type of funding comes from the government? And then we can both talk about, or you can chat about what that funding also translates in the school system as well. So there's like different tiers of support that are being offered.
Yes. So essentially, my son is high functioning autistic. So he is, and I have access to resources because of people that I know and that I have connected with. So it's almost like an underground railroad of
Mhm.
resources. And it's pretty insane that it has to be that way. But essentially, if you don't have access, you are on waiting lists to get the testing. You need to get the diagnosis to be able to apply for the funding. And then the funding, you would get a certain amount per year. These schools also are supposed to have funding for special needs, but it gets very mismanaged and they don't bring in the supports and are, matter of fact, cutting said supports to a large degree. So the process to actually get to the end result of getting funding is probably anywhere between 3 to 10 years between the wait lists of the funding itself and then the wait lists to get some of the additional resources depending on what their needs are. Um,
That is frightening. I'm just going to jump in because I know from my background and my education about children with autism or children with differing abilities, the key is early identification so that you understand and know what the issue is, and then you can work to find solutions from there. However, if parents are being caught in this loop of having to wait for identification from, and this comes from pediatricians, or I know at least in London we had CPRI, which was the Children's Psychiatric Research Institute, and a lot of doctors working from that facility would be, on our meeting notes of diagnosing a child with autism. So just to interject, I
well,
don't know the process.
some of the larger, like CAMH or some of the larger entities that have assessment options,
Yeah,
they have longer wait lists. There are some pediatricians that can do the testing, which is a
yeah.
lot faster, which is what I was able to do with my son through a pediatrician that was licensed to do so. And then so now it's just the wait list. So 4 to 5 years, he's gonna be like 10 before he gets any funding.
That
And
hurts my heart because I know how many students I used to teach at the JK level who were not identified, and what they need is help right then. You can't put a band-aid on the solution and say, we don't know what's wrong with a child who's really not functioning well, and then stick them in a classroom full of children and not have the support that they need.
absolutely. And they have trouble with self-regulation, right? So
Mhm.
And that there's a cost to supporting them with their regulation or with their learning. They have a lot of specialists that address certain things. And luckily for my son, I have the training. But of course, even with all the training, you still like there are things outside of my wheelhouse that I could use some extra support in terms of bringing in a specialist, like an OT or
Yeah.
something that will just kind of level him even further. Um, and some of those things are really, really costly, and not to discount, speech language, or they are so valuable and the cost is worth it, but the funding is just, it's not there, and kids are getting cut out. And this is the legacy we're leaving behind. And if our kids are not equipped to handle what's coming in the future, we're going to have a bit of and honestly, kids with a lot of differing needs, they have a lot to bring to the table in
They
ways that.
absolutely do. Absolutely. I would love to highlight that because I think oftentimes, especially in the school that I taught in, we had a very high population of students from other countries coming in, and a lot of these countries had heard through the grapevine that our school was great for special needs, and they would come from other countries with children who were not diagnosed because in those countries it would be a source of great shame. And yeah, children with special needs are not treated very well in other countries as well, especially by family members. Being it's a source of shame, a lot of parents were embarrassed and they didn't identify. And I think in terms of working through that crisis of knowing your child is different and they need a lot of help in certain areas, they overlook the fact that they have so many amazing gifts in other areas. Like all kids have these amazing abilities. But it's interesting that you say you need a lot of help with certain specialists because all kids are different, right? So once you pinpoint the areas that you really could use help in, that's where you get into the expensive funding, well, expense of trying to find the specialists that would help you out the best.
Oh, definitely. And I know the government had said they're going to contribute over $50 million, but that's not going to go where it needs to go. It's not. I'm sorry, it will not. Educators who work with special needs kids actually need training around violent behaviors. And there is very practical training that you can do. So you can learn how to de-escalate and, create safe spaces and support them in the healthiest way possible. There are so many trainings that could be implemented to support educators, because this is going to be a very big deal and a very growing sector.
Absolutely.
We need the staff. You can ignore it only for so long, and we are going to. So anybody who's interested in this field, I really suggest um, you invest in yourself in training, because when you are great, you will never be unemployed, because we need people with the patience of saints and the hearts of angels in
Absolutely.
in
I think
approaching this.
this is like a good segue into what we are going to share next about how it looks in the system right now. Because, like you said, the 50 million, I think we need transparency and funding everywhere. I think right now, even politically, globally, you are seeing a lot of like revolving doors towards union employees or certain bureaucracies into upper level admin. And it's not making a lot of sense because then you don't see the changes on the front line that you need. So to put this into perspective, there are a lot of so like fabulous EAs, so many very, very hardworking, caring, compassionate educational assistants in the United States. They're called aides, and they are often specialized and trained in certain types of specialties. For example, there might be an educational assistant that's really great with autism, and that's what they went to school for. Um, However, when you don't pay them well, when they're making a salary of 30 something thousand, maybe they're at the top year of their career and they're making 40,000, that doesn't get you very far. So oftentimes a lot of the support staff that we have in our schools are also going to jobs like the youth centers at night, and they do sleep shifts and they work in group homes just to make ends meet. And then when they get to the school system and their opinions are not valid, it becomes a really huge source of resentment. Like, why are they going to spend the time and the effort every single day to help students that are very, very taxing, very taxing? They could be violent, they could be is screaming, they could be runners, and the EAs are not getting the support that they need either. Just reflected in, even honestly, they weren't invited to a lot of the spec ed meetings as well. So the teacher would sit in there, yet the EAs that is dealing with a student every single day is not able to talk to the specialists that are giving recommendations, sometimes not even knowing the student that they're talking about.
Oh,
They're
that's
just looking at it from a piece of paper.
I've worked at almost like every level. From, like I've worked as an EA as well, and it's terrible how they're treated. And I'm also like a CYW. They get paid poverty. It's more
Yeah.
beneficial for them to work at a grocery store. They would get more income and less aggression, and that has to change. They can't be paid at poverty with the expectation of handling complex behaviors. They should be a part of the conversation. They should have proper training so that they learn how to protect themselves, protect the child. And that's where some of
Mhm.
that hands-on training is needed. And, you know, from the lens of a parent, and I saw in the news as well, there was parents that were moving to specific areas to
Yeah.
be with highly effective staff in a school that specializes in, only to have moved and then they pulled half of the staff.
Yeah.
But the half of the staff that is left behind, how many are going to stay when they are now doing double the work because you just removed half of the support population and you have not increased their salaries?
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, actually. You bring up a really good point that I think the majority of families in Ontario don't know about, or anywhere, right? This is applicable. When we talk about the issues, we try to choose the most basic level ones that affect everyone in every single country. More so, our focus is on Canada and United States, but you see this growing in every area. However, when we go back to what this looks like in the classroom, it brings up a really good point of what you just said. Like, the EAs are not being paid, they're not being supported, and it, it it's very, very apparent.
Oh, oh yeah, it wears down on you. Even as like an educator, people would tell me they're like, "You're really great at dealing with difficult children and all this behavior." I'm like, I can't do this all the time. I have to
Mhm.
take breaks in between and deal with children with less needs because you're living in this chaos. And so I'd be giving administrators these recommendations of like, you have to break up the day for these support staff. You can't have them living in chaos consistently day to day, without something coming
The
like,
burnout rate is
yeah,
so high.
it
It's
is so
so,
high.
so high. And oftentimes, too, you'll see, like we've chatted about before, and we all know this happens in every single workplace where there's always really lazy people. And oftentimes, lazy people go to hide out in those jobs that are less conspicuous. Like they know the ropes and they know where they can get away with it. And this is not saying this is occurring in every single instance. However, you and I both have had experience where maybe those teachers are hanging out in the spec ed classroom because there's four EAs that are working with like 10 children that are very, very high needs, so that the teaching component is really not as taxing as it is would be like with the EAs supporting the children, if that makes sense, or in learning support teacher roles. And sorry, I know you were going to say something.
Well, I just think if it's not taxing, people aren't putting enough energy into it either. They don't always put the best of the best in special needs, which actually breaks my heart. Especially in rough areas.
Yeah,
Like you should be planning individually for the kids. I know you're more well versed in the IEP like sector, but they're not following any kind of plans that they've made for the kid. Like, do they even
they're not.
update them?
And the cuts that they're making at the board level too, that's what I wanted to touch on as well. When they're cutting board funding, when the school boards are in debt, that's what they cut. They cut the supports to the front lines, and that really affects, that trickles down, right? That causes burnout among EAs who are being put one to one with kids that are really, 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 really high needs, and they need some breaks in there. Then they cut the funding to the resources available to teachers. And in terms of IEPs, oh my goodness. So in recent years, I don't know how it used to work in the States, but I have many friends and family members that work there, and it was very similar, but they had more funding for this area. Canada does not. Ontario started cutting funding so that the learning support teacher who had their specialist in spec ed, or at least some coursework, right? To get your specialist, it takes 3 courses, and most of them would at least have level 1, and they couldn't be in that position. So they would be so overrun with other stuff that they no longer wrote IEPs. So then there'd be new teachers in the school system that'd be like, what do you mean I have to write IEPs for 7 of my kids in this grade 3 class? I don't know how to do that, because there's very specific ways that you have to write them, and it's a legally binding document. So a lot of the times, the teachers who are writing them don't have the experience and the background knowledge on how to write it specifically. And in terms of what I experienced with my learning support teacher, who I previously talked about was just in early retirement there and not doing her job, they would write down that the children were being regularly pulled from the classroom to receive one-to-one support or small group support, and that was never happening. And then added to that issue, and I'm not saying all learning support teachers, some are absolutely amazing and they are run off their feet and they don't get their lunch breaks because they're working so hard with every area that they can. However, that compounds again with the lack of funding, and then they're cutting more and more, and then there's no teachers. So if you have 3 teachers at your school that are off sick and their jobs haven't been filled, the first person they pull is the learning support teacher. So not only are they doing their role, but they're also filling in for substitute teachers right now. And I think that is more of the issue that we're seeing in the last maybe 2, 3, 4 years.
Probably.
However, yeah, you could go ahead.
Um, no, I was just thinking you're completely right. They pull them left, right, and center. And if you want meaningful change, you need to be consistent for a prolonged period of time. Like even with my son's behavioral needs and stuff, I have seen progress because of the consistency I was able to do at home. And a lot of parents are needing that consistency, because you can have even the best IEP in the world, but if you don't have people implementing things, addressing, like really pouring into the child and really being thoughtful about their programming and their growth, you're not going to get anywhere. And I don't
Absolutely. Consistency would be key in any kind of behavioral change, right?
know.
Even at the adult level, if you're having issues with somebody, you want to see consistency in behavioral change, or else it's not meaningful. If somebody comes in one day and says, okay, I'm going to fix things like this, and these are my recommendations, and then leaves, I don't know where the accountability is in that. So I think it's definitely reflective in the way we treat our children. And I think another huge point is that inclusion is often a buzzword nowadays in education. You hear it everywhere: inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. And children are better off with their peer groups. And, there's so much research, and it's such a buzzword that it actually becomes a little bit sickening to me, because inclusion means that you actually have the proper support. So inclusion isn't throwing 5 to 10 special needs students in a regular classroom and then pulling all their support. That's abandonment. And then that is a recipe for creating so many more issues. That's why we are seeing the high levels of violence in the classroom. That's why we are seeing the teachers leaving teaching as a mass exodus. The ones who are retiring early at 50 and finding alternative work, the educational assistants that say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to go work at the post office or Costco because I can make better money and I get to go in, do my job, and leave, and I don't have to bring it home. I don't have to wear Kevlar because people aren't biting me or kicking me or slapping me or breaking my bones. And that trickles down to your own children in the classroom as well, because if they're in a regular classroom and they have students with special needs, every single family member, I'm sure, hears about children every single day that really aren't handling the regular classroom well. So when the support isn't there to support them, it's not inclusion. It's
Oh,
a lie.
it's
They're
true.
lying.
I have seen, so because my experience was extreme mental health,
Hmm.
sometimes I was asked to go into these classrooms, and the way they would criticize the teacher if there were behavioral issues in the classroom made me sick. I was like, how can you set or you set him, well, the teacher up by throwing all these behavioral needs, calling it inclusion, when these behavior needs are beyond the parameters of mainstream education. So the
Yeah.
mainstream is just like the middle road. Any kid that operates on either side of the road on a more excessive level, you can't just throw them into traffic. And it just doesn't make sense. And then you blame it on the teacher. No, these are some of these kids' behaviors are actually aligned with, I'm sorry to say, but like more institutionalized type behavior where there's more like secure boundaries, a secure environment where, you hide the sharps, you hide, like things are a lot more regulated and conducive to an environment that has stronger environmental structure through, and you're just throwing them in.
It's
All,
gaslighting. It's absolute gaslighting. You're so right. And you see it so often. And then really amazing educators that have their heart and their soul into their love of children and wanting to make a difference feel when you criticize anyone, right, that this is your fault, they start to like really take it badly. And that leads to the emotional and like mental burnout as well. However, that's what they do. That's the model. That's the spec ed specialist coming into your classroom and observing and seeing what else can be done. I've had them come into my classroom and I literally had this is a fun story. I had a student that I loved for JK and SK, and then I moved to grade one, and he was in my class that year as well. And he came from a different country. He was not identified and very high needs, low functioning, autistic. And the spec ed specialist that was there the first day came to my classroom, and we shared a cubby with the next door kindergarten classroom as well, who had just received a box of like Kevlar gloves and a whole bunch of instructions where there was a seat where you were supposed to like belt the child in. It was a special OT one. It wasn't like something illegal. It actually was like from a professional, but they didn't receive prior knowledge about this. And so the spec ed specialist was in that day. Their classroom was torn apart because the student wasn't like, it was the first time she was in a classroom with 30 other kids in kindergarten. And for us, she gave the recommendation for a student that was diapered, nonverbal, and a runner to put stop signs everywhere on the doors so that they knew not to run, because the idea would be that they're recognizing the visual, right?
Mhm.
And then a month later, when she comes back, we were using the visual of the stop sign on the doors, and lo and behold, it didn't work. The runner would still run out the doors. And with kindergarten, at least that's the school I worked at, the door outside would lead to the yard. So it was a big deal. And her solution was he was obviously very upset during, he had a lot of tantrums in the classroom and he was very upset to see the stop signs, so to take them down. So in one hand, they recommend this insanely ridiculous idea to stop very dangerous behavior, and then on the other side they come back a month later and you're at fault because you used what they said to use. So it's complete gaslighting. That's just one example. I'm sure you have 1,000 different ones as well, but in terms of blaming educational assistants, blaming early childhood educators, blaming teachers for all the issues that are being presented behaviorally, and then the parents jump on board too, right? So
It's I find parents a little bit easier once they know that you care about their child, and they're
Absolutely.
actually a little bit easier to get on board because they genuinely do want their kids to be successful. Getting the rest of the people on board in community is always a bit of a challenge because of lack of not like understanding. Um, I was thinking actually what I would have done if the kid was a runner like that, what I did, that always it always worked. And I explained to the child, if you want to run, run, but run here. I gave them like a sanctuary space.
Mhm.
You are here, sanctuary. Nobody will bother you and no one will talk to you. You need space. You go in there, take space. Don't break things. You said whatever the rules, but
Right.
you run here because they're probably having sensory overload. Honestly, it worked every time. But
That
when
would
like
be lovely if we could implement that into kindergarten classrooms, but yeah.
in kindergarten, if you start seeing behavioral needs right off the bat, they should talk to the parents about having an extra support, like a small group. If
Mhm.
people started, like you said, if it's implemented early, you would see so many of these problems dissipate because they are a blank canvas of,
Mhm.
and
Absolutely.
it's so much easier to, like, adults have higher expectations of children for change than they do for themselves, which is,
I love it.
and
That
we,
actually brings up a really good point, Jeanette, so we can segue into solutions because Jeanette and I are both busy moms too, and we know that a half hour of our podcast is usually max if you're listening to it on driving your kids around or going to the grocery store or whatever. So we are going to try to streamline our episodes. In terms of solutions, I see more and more parents with special needs children pulling their children to homeschool because they feel like they can do a better job themselves. And oftentimes you hear time and time again that their behaviors decrease once they're in that loving, safe, supportive environment at home instead of the chaos of peers, more students, bells all the time, the noise. Um, yeah.
and as things like we're in a very, Jillian framed it as messy middle, and we are very much in that messy middle. I like how she said that because transitions are messy, but our systems as they stand came from Prussia. So
Hmm.
we're talking about Nazi Germany, and these structures are not meant for the success of children. Things are going to change. I know, like with Refound Education, as we, talk to investors, talk to people in the community, one of the number one things that we want to address is the supports for kids. And there are actually ways that you can structure things to make them incredible. But the objective for the many powers that be are not exactly to improve the situation. I don't know if they want a society of thinkers necessarily,
Well,
but
you know they don't.
but we want our kids to be thinkers because our
Absolutely.
children are part of that legacy. So the people have to find the solutions themselves. And I really think if we implement certain structures that are community centered, restorative, authentically inclusive,
Yeah.
authentically equitable, and we can start putting money where it counts on the front lines with the kids. And I do think there's going to be a lot of shifts. Some people will not be happy, but know that whenever, like, for example, middle management is going to be whittled away, and not only in education, in a lot of industries, right?
Yeah.
It's,
We're seeing that already politically,
yes.
especially with the US election and what they're planning to do. I think the majority of people recognize that middle management in a lot of different systems are taking up a lot of funding that the front lines needs.
And the tech investment, quite frankly, the tech industry is blowing up. You can't ignore it.
Mhm.
I do think, innovation should be done ethically and conscientiously, but I also like, will have an impact on jobs. So, but I don't want people to be scared because new opportunities are going to arise. You can never erase the work that you've put in. And there will always be new opportunities or, just opportunities to do things on your own. So, me and Andrea have dove in feet first.
I
um,
think just even changing our perspective to stop focusing on what kids cannot do. That's the whole school system, right? That's the reporting system, that's report cards, progress reports, meetings, everything is what your child cannot do. Instead of focusing on all these amazing different abilities and what they can achieve and their different gifts. So if we can actually reframe things to make that in a smaller system more supportive, I think we're going to see our children flourish. But right now, the system just doesn't work because it's creating a lot of shame and guilt and comparison and all of these really nasty feelings that kids are being programmed with that you could go anywhere today and ask somebody who's 50, 60, 70 how they felt in school, and they're always going to remember those teachers that made them feel really small. And we need to stop that.
for sure. And honestly, I know people are a little scared. I got put in timeout on Instagram for saying this.
Oh.
Are highlighting that they are going to be amalgamating the school boards because they changed legislature.
Mhm.
And but to save $1.5 billion a year just in one province, do you know what we could do with that? Imagine all these kids that need support, all the people that need jobs. Like there is so much we can pour into and just pour where it matters because
That's a really good point. I think all eyes need to be on. And I know we've touched on it in previous podcasts before it even became like widespread news at the end of September, because we record these a little bit earlier and then release them. So I think all eyes are on the audits that are coming up to certain school boards, especially Thames Valley District School Board in being audited and seeing how they're spending money. And regardless of whether things are in line with the budget and things are not, I think everyone kind of knows that when you go unchecked in accountability for so long in any area of the workforce, this is not just education. If somebody has free rein on spending, not your money, taxpayer money, then there are going to be always those inconsistencies and people who take advantage, or even just people who are used to it and not used to accounting for it, right? Or reporting to anyone.
oh, exactly. And well, where are the results, right? It's
Yeah.
like when you have a for profit, and I know some people are like, oh no, but I think it's great because then you choose, you see the results. You if it makes sense, it makes sense. But some of these public sectors, health too, right? It just
Yeah.
the expenses are ballooning. Like think about health insurance, how much they charge if you're insured versus not insured in the West countries versus other countries. We have to get a rein on it, and greed cannot be the main um, center focus. It's where is our future going and what are we leaving behind?
I love that. That's a really good question to end off with today, I think. This was an awesome discussion. Jeanette and I could honestly talk about this at length in any situation. So we're cutting it short, but we do have a podcast coming up too with Sylvie from.
Agora Prep. We're going to talk about disempowering disabilities. She is such a powerhouse, and her passion and investment in all children of varied abilities is just really inspirational. And yeah, I can't wait for you
I
guys
can't
to.
wait.
I know she's such a firecracker and she's such a wonderful leader. So we're excited about that.
That's awesome. And as always, if you ever have any comments or questions or you'd like us to dive into a certain subject, please feel free to touch base with Jeanette or I. And thank you so much for listening to Limitless EdX today.